G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day and importantly a fantastic midweek. You're almost at the weekend. Now legends, of course, as always, we have a lot to talk about. Of course, we have to look at the maps and we'll compare maps, and there has been a loss of an aircraft that does in a way confirm something we talked about the other day for close air support, and we need to look at a new offensive that was opened by Ukraine into Belgorod. Now, I have a lot of geolocations and a lot of footage, and it has appeared to fail very quickly upon entry, although we will, of course, keep updated with it because it's always hard to know in the opening days of anything. But of course, the biggest news of the day is going to be the ceasefire between Trump and Putin that was then negotiated, brokered on the phone. But as you've probably read in the title, I think that this has really been a bad move that this has occurred for Ukraine. When we look at strategic and tactical abilities of weapons, as well as the effort gone into those. So we're going to break that down completely. And that is, of course, where we will start. So where we'll start is actually with what Trump posted on his social media website, truth.com. Now, my phone conversation today with President Putin of Russia was a very good, productive one. We agreed to an immediate ceasefire on all energy and infrastructure, with an understanding that we will be working quickly to have a complete ceasefire and ultimately an end to this horrible war between Russia and Ukraine. This war would never have started if I were president. Many elements of a contract for peace were discussed, including the fact thousands of soldiers are being killed, and both President Putin and President Zelensky would like to see it end. This process is now in full force and effect. Hopefully, for the sake of humanity, we'll get the job done. Now, this is my initial take on this, is I believe Putin has played Trump like a fiddle here. This is one of the benefits to being more of an authoritarian leader. You're in for a lot longer, therefore for your world order you can be more competent at it. One of the biggest problems I believe we have just in general is people then measure competency of how they feel about it. So, for instance, you can say, I don't agree with Putin, but is Putin very competent at where he sees Russia's move and world order? I would say yes, and this is what you build over years and years or decades in power. This is where I have expressed concern when you put, say, Sergei Lavrov in a room with Marco Rubio, just who has been doing it longer and the experience to then negotiate and then play the other side. I believe that this is catastrophic for Ukraine. And of course, the truth will come out in time. Now, the original ceasefire that was broken between Ukraine and the US, they wanted peace in the skies, the sea, and land. All of these areas, all these battle spaces is where Russia hold a significant advantage. And we said at the time yesterday, we said we can't see Russia going for it, especially because they are currently in the position of power. Where Russia doesn't hold an advantage is in the geographical location of industrial and economic bases. Russia's industrial base, economic base is inside of its borders. Ukraine can target that. Ukraine's industrial and economic bases, they are outside of Ukraine's borders, at least on the majority, of course, where everywhere from where electricity is coming in to funding, it's outside of those, therefore untouchable, at least by current standards, not untouchable by the weapons, but by Russian policy. They're not going to bomb something at this point in time in Hungary or Poland or Slovakia or Germany. So that is where Russia hold then their largest disadvantage, is all that can be targetable. But if Russia's energy then now remains untouchable from this ceasefire, their capacity for the war increases dramatically. Ukraine's domestic energy was, of course, targeted, but it was consistently backfilled from Europe, and its industrial centres, a lot of these were moved outside of Ukraine so they wouldn't be hit. So they were outside of then targeted areas. I believe that this is going to have a larger pro for Russia than it will for Ukraine. A lot of Ukraine's areas like that already couldn't be targeted. Now it's just cut off the ability to strike Russia's of these. Of course, as I've been saying for the last, say, 6 months, that false flags are very, very likely, and this, of course, presents a huge opportunity for false flags. We're going to talk about more of these strikes in a minute, between strategic, tactical, and dual use, and how I believe this does benefit Russia significantly. Okay, so let's look at what has said. The White House statement has said the leaders agreed that the movement to peace will begin with an energy and infrastructure ceasefire, as well as technical negotiations on implementation of a maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea, full ceasefire and permanent peace. These negotiations will begin immediately in the Middle East. And of course, we have spoken about the Middle East is the place to do this, as it is probably the most neutral area that still has a large position of power. And it's brokered things like this before. A translator statement from Russia's foreign ministry said the two leaders had a detailed and frank exchange of views. It said Mr. Putin responded positively to Mr. Trump's proposal for a halt on attacks on the energy infrastructure and immediately gave the Russian military the corresponding order. However, Putin raised a number of significant issues. It was emphasised that the key condition for preventing the escalation of the conflict and working towards its resolution through political and diplomatic means should be the complete cessation of foreign military aid and the provision of intelligence information to Kyiv. So they're saying a key condition here is you stop the intel and the aid going towards Ukraine. And that is, of course, significant. We saw the huge shift in only the 24 hours that it was supposedly cut off. Noel Reports is reporting this, but many are reporting similar to this. A new ultimatum from the Kremlin that Moscow is allegedly demanding that the West and Ukraine recognise Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia as Russian. Of course, this is what Putin proposed as a bit of a poison pill, but before the Swiss peace summit. Of course, Russia occupied the majority, if not all, of those areas. In return, Russia promises an end to the war and not claim more territory. Now, current powers in Ukraine and Europe, they will not accept this. But what happens if the US say, well, we can accept that and push that? Will the European powers continue the war without US aid or intelligence? So I guess we will see. Now, Zelensky has basically been told this by some other military analysts, and he has responded to this as well, saying we don't want to be on the menu. But this is something we've talked about, that this gentleman here says there's an old saying in diplomatic circles, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And believe me, Ukraine is on the menu. And this is why I've been highly critical of Ukraine not attending some of these meetings. Now, some are bilateral, but there's others that we heard Zelensky say we didn't even know it was going on, but you and me sitting back here, we knew it was going on, so that's bullshit. But this is why Ukraine, regardless of their position, even if they disagree with everything being said, they need to be at the table. But why I believe it's also critical, it is desperate that Ukraine, Zelensky, the Rada, lift the law that allows them to be at negotiations too, because currently Trump, Putin, they will be saying, hey, well, it's illegal under your own constitution for you to be here, therefore you're not going to be. And I believe that needed to be done weeks ago, that law lifted. If as soon as there was talk about diplomacy, that had to be shifted. Now let's get into these then strikes. And Zelensky's already saying that Russia has broken this, and many are saying that Russia has already broken the ceasefire. But I want to talk about where there's a lot of fog and a lot of grey zone in this. So an hour ago here, which was, say, several hours after Trump and Putin spoke, Zelensky tweeted that 40 Shaheeds were in the sky. He says there's been hits. He says civilian infrastructure. He said, and a hospital by these Shaheed Quran licensed drones. These types of nightmare attacks by Russia that destroy our energy sector, our infrastructure. And the fact that the night is no exception shows the pressure on Russia must continue for the sake of peace. So continue or improve or increase, I should say, the pressure on Russia. Putin effectively rejected the proposal for a ceasefire. So saying it's already gone out the window. This is what I say as well. We're going to see a lot of fog in the informational space, if not in the future, real blatant, maybe not blatant, but false flag events, maybe bombings at Russian oil refineries, maybe at some infrastructure energy in Ukraine. Sanctions against Russia and assistance to Ukraine, strengthening allies in the free world and working towards a security guarantee, and only real cessation of strikes on civilian infrastructure by Russia as proof its willingness to end this war can bring peace closer. So More sanctions, more everything to come. But of course, Russia's not going to agree with that at this point in time. Zelensky, about this proposal, said, "We will support such a proposal, but we're very interested in the details. What is the real proposal? What did the parties agree on? After we get the details from the American president and the American side, we will prepare our answer and the team will be ready for technical talks." So did these take place once all three sides in this have signed? I don't believe so, but we will see. See, it supports, but we're ready further for what is the technical aspects of this. But this is something that I want to say, and this is going to be, I think, critical stepping into the future here, is this ceasefire does not mean that we will stop seeing drones and missiles in the sky. This is why I believe that it heavily has a positive effect on Russia. It just means that it stops targeting energy and infrastructure. Now, it is not clear what is meant by infrastructure. Is it just civilian infrastructure? What about dual-use infrastructure? Remember, it is incredibly easy to find what is claimed as civilian infrastructure as dual-use. That is very easy. Has a military truck crossed across the Kursk bridge? Yes, dual-use. Do soldiers charge drones from a socket in their bedroom that connects back to a power plant? Yes, dual use. Are soldiers staying in an apartment block? Dual use. This is the problem with a lot of this, and this is how these attacks get signed off and justified from the Middle East to Europe. So this is where it's going to be very, very foggy, is you may see a drone hit a building, you may see a drone hit this, whether a Ukrainian or a Russian, and we need to ask further of, well, what actually is that? At the end of the day, under the military law, power plants are dual use. You can target then electrical energy stations because it is used, and in modern warfare used more and more and more. Okay? So this is where it's going to get very, very messy, but it is not going to stop things flying in the air. Now, further, Russia's air defense issue, the biggest issue they have is Russia is such a vast land and has so many, say, energy facilities or stockpiles that it's actually impossible to protect all of this, no matter how much air defense you actually had. And this is why we have seen Ukrainian slow-moving drones in large numbers wreak havoc on these facilities. But notice how these drones have relatively little effect on Russia's military infrastructure and airfields. I say relatively when we look at then the oil depots. Now Russia can move any of this extra AD that may be around these energy areas into such areas as military infrastructure. Now, of course, Ukraine can do the same, but as I stated in slide 1, many of these areas are already geographically protected outside the border, so it's not going to have the same effect that it's going to have on Russia. I see that stopping attacks due to where these are, what economies are based on, is going to have a huge effect more so on Russia positively of these strikes stopping against energy than it will Ukraine. And against infrastructure, and that dual use is going to be a very large question mark over that. Now, Noel reports, President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, Russia is preparing for a future confrontation with European countries. She highlighted that Russia has significantly expanded its military industrial production capacities. Now, it is amazing how simultaneously Russia has been defeated and strategically compromised, but remains a credible threat to confront NATO in a hot war. The warmongering coming from the two women leading the EU as Kaja Kallas and Ursula von der Leyen, it is unbelievable. They push Ukraine to fight on as Russia's defeat is close or imminent, but they'll also state things like this. What I'll say, love, is that it cannot be both. There's a lot of paradoxes we see. We see the Putin paradox of he's a crazy this, that, but trusts him with nuclear weapons. We see the Russian paradox around industry, that it's completely defeated, yet it is a real threat to the entirety of NATO. We see then the EU paradox of the EU saying we'll do everything it takes for as long as it takes, meanwhile giving more money to Russian energy giants than it is to Ukraine. And we see Ukraine's then manpower paradox. Of course, that the biggest problem is men, but they're not willing to mobilise younger men due to the fact that that is the future. The sheer hypocrisy and leaning into delusion of some of these is amazing and does have tangible negative effects on the front line both by weapon and by information as well. And information is incredibly important. That Noel reports again. He reports that Zelensky has said that Putin plans a massive offensive in Zaporizhia, Sumy and Kharkiv directions, aiming to expand gains in the east within the next few months. The goal, to escalate attacks and to enter negotiations from a position of peace. So saying that there are huge attacks coming, although we know that they were out of weapons more than 3 years ago. But this does make sense. Firstly, we need to say that Russia is already in a position of strength. And the area where Ukraine has focused a lot of its energy, money, its men and time has been into drones and missiles to strike Russian energy has overnight become, well, it's been done somewhat in vain and has become somewhat less useful. I wrote useless here, but I'll say less useful. But in my opinion, and I've been heavily critical of this, and you would have seen this, is Ukraine put way too much effort, time, men, money into strategic strikes, not tactical. There wasn't a healthy balance of pushing for long-range drones and men and shells. You just instead have 50 different types of drones to strike these strategic assets because, and there's a reason for this, because Ukraine believed through the European partners that strikes on the Russian economy would then have an imminent collapse, and that would be the way to winning. Now this has somewhat been turned off. That is a huge, huge loss, but you're stuck with all of these weapon systems, which, as I shared back in slide maybe 4 or 5, that these weapon systems are strategic systems going against areas because Russia has so many oil depots and or ammo dumps that are less protected by AD, it's going to have a huge, huge effect. But it does make sense for Russia to have further attacks to put themselves in a greater position of power. Now, without the risk of strike, Russia will be able to move more assets into these frontline areas away from, say, an oil depot. If Ukraine has anything left in the tank to make tactical gains, now would absolutely be the time, because now we've seen the collapse of Kursk, which happened at the worst time possible. Then that is another card massively off the table. So I wouldn't be surprised to see then large offensives into some of these areas, but I think it would be more likely just the continual grind that we see. Maybe into Sumy, potentially move troops out of there, then into Zap. And we have been following and looking at a lot of further escalations in Zap. But I guess the TLDR of this is I think that this deal to not strike these strategic economic areas has a much more positive effect on Russia than it does Ukraine, because a lot of Ukrainians couldn't be targeted anyway. Now, this is, I guess, on a side note. This Marko Mihkelson, he's the chairman of Foreign Affairs Committee of the Estonian Parliament, and he shares this of my friend who basically says F Trump, that he's a Russian bitch and that our drones destroyed blah 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 this here, and I show this because I want to show you how the US administration is sort of feeling towards Europe. His next tweet was, and Marco's next tweet was, for the sake of a just peace, Russia must be defeated in their war of aggression. And we wonder why the US administration is moving away from Europe. We look at things like what J.D. Vance said in Munich, and this guy's boss at the end of the day is the bloodthirsty Kazakallis, who tweeted that the free world needs a new leader, referring to Trump. Now, I don't know if anyone else feels this, but I'm sure if I'm feeling it, many are feeling it, that the smallest dogs have the loudest bark. And if I was German or French, I'd be pretty sick of a country with a tiny population, a relatively tiny GDP, a military with 0 tanks, 0 fighter jets, a couple of trainers, but no actual fighter jets, having the same influence or more, or a louder voice for the future of Europe than the countries that are 60% of the GDP and 80+% of the firepower. This is why I believe that we're going to see some major changes once the EU is under pressure. The EU is under pressure already. That is going to lift very, very quickly, especially with the US moving around, Germany, France. We will see. Anyway, let's have a look at the map. So, of course, we have Ukraine in the center of your screen. The red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. Now, the first place we're going to come is Belgorod. Now, we need to look at where then this crossing took place. Now, the way to find this is just basically to go to where the borders meet. We're looking for then Turia here as well. Now, I've already screenshotted this to have a look, as well as some of the geolocated footage here. So this will be a fair bit easier to see once I bring this up. So we have Turia down here, Marine here, and this geolocation, if we can come right in, is basically on this road here. So depending which way it came in, let's say it was the shortest, about 500 meters past the Ukraine-Russian border, what we see is in this geolocation here, Russian drones really picking apart, let me mute this down, a lot of the Ukrainian vehicles, both tanks, IFVs and engineering vehicles that did cross into this area. So we see then a vehicle hit here, and then another one presumably destroyed here. And these are some very important vehicles being taken out as well. Let me show you further on this. So we see this footage here. These are Russian drones in Belgorod area, this targeting further vehicles. And we move down, you can see coming up the arse of another vehicle. Don't clip that. And then we see then engineering vehicles being taken out as well. These engineering vehicles next to then these dragon's teeth, these are very, very rare and very important vehicles. And a second one here being then destroyed also. These are very critical vehicles for breakthroughs. And it does look like, at least what it looks like, is that about 500 meters in, it really got picked apart. Now, Rob Lee reports on this. Russian channels today said that Ukrainian forces attacked across the border into Belgorod Oblast. Videos show analog and fiber optic cable Lancet and mine strikes on Ukrainian Bradley. Of course, very important vehicles, BMPs and other types of vehicles. Also, a lot of footage of being struck on quad bikes, and it does show significant loss of man and machine. Realistically, at this point in time, the information that is presented has no significant gain or foothold anywhere much beyond even the dragon's teeth. But this is being reported from the foreign correspondent for The Economist, Oliver Carroll. Just as Putin talked with Trump, Ukrainians staged a surprise raid into Russia's Belgorod province, south of Kursk. I am told the operation was 3 weeks in the making. The idea is to create a buffer zone like Putin threatened in Ukraine. A source says there are several kilometers inside Russia and moving now. The only geolocations are at the dragon's teeth, about 500 meters in. And it does look like at this point in time, it was completely picked apart by both the fiber optic and then the radio controlled drones. AMK is reporting on this. Russian sources report the Ukrainian forces are attempting to break through the border between Sumy and Kursk oblasts in the direction in this here. Now, but this isn't, I guess, completely correct. I actually believe that this, just north of here is where you get Kursk. It was actually down in Belgorod. It was difficult in the beginning to know where exactly this is coming from. They claim the accumulation of manpower, the clearing of passages and minefields. Groups of Ukrainian infantry began attacking Belgorod Oblast under cover of heavy artillery and MLRS strikes. Russian forces are responding with their own artillery and multiple launch rocket systems, and of course the massive drones that we saw. Destruction of 2 Ukrainian tanks by FPV and several more vehicles as well. It doesn't look like an offensive, but rather an attempt to stretch Russian border units. Again, everything you do, if you push, it pulls. So it further then stretches your forces as well. And I continually, from Kursk to here, do not understand why these high-end troops, this planning, the effort, the machinery is not used to try and stabilize somewhere that is completely falling, rather than having, I guess, what I'll call missions for optics that can backfire massively. And this is about what we're going to speak about now. Like, we come up into Kursk, we see Basivkia. Now, no changes shown on this. Now, is this because what Trump claims of thousands encircled in here, and that he's been talking to Putin to try and have some way of this not turning into a massacre? We don't know, but we saw very quick movements, and then it just absolutely halt dead. So let's have a look then at Suryak. Now he is showing down towards Basivkia. This is the red dot. This is Basivkia here. The Russian army made new advances in the central part inside of Sumy, and that cross into Sumy that we said was a huge threat if this area ever fell. And what I say about the encirclement is I believe nothing shows physical encirclement of Ukrainian forces, but for months we have seen that there is a strategic level of encirclement, from the Iskanders to the drones to then artillery in here. It's become a trap. And if you just go back months and months, you can find videos of mine where there are guys saying that they can't get even evac'd out of here. And this comes off someone then behind the scenes. Matt, back in September, you were saying you didn't understand why Ukrainian troops weren't withdrawing from Kursk. And I understand that if they did and then redeployed to the east, Russian troops in Kursk might just move into Sumy. So Ukraine could either keep reinforcing Kursk at the cost of large losses in men and material, or accept some territorial losses in Sumy, which would have been bad mostly for PR reasons. I didn't think Ukrainian leaders would keep reinforcing Kursk over and over again until total collapse, leading to large losses and territorial losses in Sumy anyway. They had a choice between losing military resources and losing face, and ultimately they chose to lose both. And I've said again and again that Sumy is either going to be the greatest Kursk is going to be the greatest four-dimensional chess game ever played, or the largest military blunder leading to a lot of negative consequences in negotiations. And I believe 99% it is the latter, but I keep that small bit open because all the decisions have gone against my knowledge of the doctrine in this. I have some doubt. I'm like, how could this have occurred without some level of end game? Does that make sense? Okay, we're going to look up and down the maps a little bit more. Now, what I showed you the other day was down around the Lobkove front here, in the direction, I believe, of Shabaki. I showed you Russian LMUR helicopter-fired munitions hitting a building. Now, what I said in this was this tells us a few things. It tells us about air defense, and it tells us about the ability to have close air support. And that's why we reported on it, is that is a shift. And what I said 2 days ago was we're seeing that increase. Now, I presumed it was a Kar 52 because it is most likely when we see that going to be off a Kar 52, but we have seen fighter bomber report a loss of a Mi-28. Now, of course, a Mi-28, this can also fire these weapon systems. It's just not as numerous, so there's more odds of it being a Kar 52. We've seen that loss. Now, we're drawing a pretty fucking long bow here. You'd think I'm from Estonia, but what I'm saying is it's probably been lost in that direction where we've seen the recent pickup in rotary wing assets. I'm not saying it's the same chopper, but we've seen an increase there that tells us stuff about HIMARS and Storm Shadows and man-pads as well. Remember, we're analysing a whole war here. Now, let's move our way up into then Velyka Novosilka, of course, an area which, well, it depends who you watch. You may not be familiar with this at all because many people have never actually accepted the loss of this area and then the exploitation past this. But we do see a large area in the direction of Privleny coming under then Russian control. But once we bring up then the Syriac map here, we see some very, very large shifts. So let me then minimize this one. So we need to talk about this front. Now, around Constantinople, which sits over here, the Ukrainian army made some ground back. Now, this is where we are talking right in here. But to the north of here, we do see significant gains being made in some of the plains that sit just north of Andriivka, below this as well. So this is Andriivka, this is Constantinople, where Ukraine had some pushback in here, according to then Syriac, but also to the south, just down towards Rozliv. This is Rozliv, that Russians had an advancement. And this is just down here, you'd see Velyka Novosilka. So we see on the western side, that is where Deep State is showing that red check, so we can confirm that. But then on the eastern side of here, we do see significant gains made to the north of Rozdolny. So this is Rozdolny right in here, and movements right up through here. Now, these maps, it's not good enough quality to get a really, really good idea of what is happening in here, but I believe right to about here if we line the paddocks up. So some significant changes for both Russia and Ukraine happening then around this front line. We'll continue moving our way up, and we don't see any real significant changes until we get up onto then Terny. So north of Terny, north of Nevsky, we do see a Russian advancement here of some roughly 1.6, 1.5, so let's say a mile gains in here. But if we come just south into Terny, Syriac is saying that there are changes here as well. So we can have a look. It's harder to see on the yellow, but just in this direction out in here that there was some further gains expanding then across the reservoirs here, this north of Novolubivka. So this is then, oh, sorry, this is incorrect. So we have, of course, Terny down here. It's actually in this direction in here. We see Novolubivka in here, so north and northwest. So we can see, it's hard to see in the see this right, I'm pointing at my screen. See this right here? This is indicating definite movement in here, but indicating further movement, if we come out here, just in this direction, apologies, in here, okay? So legends, that is all that I have for you today. But this ceasefire if we put a pros and cons list, I think has far more pros for Russia due to industrial bases than it does for Ukraine. It's put a lot of effort into moving those industrial areas outside of Ukraine, but also into weapons, man, machine, everything to target those Russian strategic assets. This is why you always need a healthy balance of tactical and strategic assets. Anyway, legends, you have a fantastic day and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you.